අද්විතීය 200 Mbps ස්පීඩ් එකකින් ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ වේගවත්ම සහ පුළුල්තම හෝම් බ්‍රෝඩ්බෑන්ඩ් සම්බන්ධතාවය වන SLT මොබිටෙල් දේශීය ෆයිබර් බලවේගය ඔබත් අදම අත්විඳින්න.
හරිම සුදුයි.
Tonight on First at 9 this Saturday the 8th of July 2023. High-level visit. Indian Foreign Secretary Vinay Mohan Quatra to visit Sri Lanka next week before President Ranil Wickremesinghe's visit to India. Sufficiency and fairness. Former Central Bank Director Dr. Roshan Pereira highlights key issues in domestic debt restructuring.
Particularly in terms of the domestic debt restructuring, whether it was sufficient, and secondly, whether there was fairness across creditors.
Says domestic debt restructuring must be once and for all.
We must be very sure that this is once and for all debt restructuring.
Concerns. Exporters worried over government's decision to abolish simplified value-added tax.
As apparel exporters, we aren't happy they abolished their SWAT.
Additional cost of electricity, the fuel and other expenses have gone up a lot. So this is why we are worried. We don't want again keep a lot of our money with the Inland Revenue Department.
However, Finance Ministry assures that a proper mechanism will be in place before its abolishment.
If we are taking out SWAT, definitely there will be a proper refunding mechanism.
Positive signs. Economy is improving, says the central bank.
All the indicators show in consumer confidence is coming back.
However, says that the fiscal consolidation process must continue.
Alliance Finance මෙතුරු රන්නයි සේවාවෙන් රන් පවුම්කට රුපියල් 1,70,000ක ඉහළ අධිකාරම.
ඔබේ විශ්වාසය දිනු සෙන්සුරයින් දැන් ළඟමැති ෆාමසියෙන් ලබාගත හැක.
This is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Good evening and welcome to AdaDerana First at 9. I'm AdaDerana Singh joining you live with the latest in Sri Lanka and around the world. Now in your top story tonight, Central Bank Governor Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe reiterated that Sri Lanka is moving on a positive path in terms of economic recovery, adding that the country is gradually regaining the lost consumer confidence. During an interview with CNBC, the Central Bank Governor went on to say that the fiscal consolidation process must continue as announced in the IMF program. Further, the governor emphasized that the period of economic recovery provides an opportunity to implement structural reforms and ensure that the country is moving on the correct path.
How would you describe sentiment amongst Sri Lankan consumers and business now?
If you look at now compared to that situation, there are no more shortages essential, not at all. And also prices of petroleum, gas, all these things are also coming down. And also government has relaxed a lot of import controls that time for us to manage balance of payment. That also has eased a lot, and all other relaxation will be eased going forward. All the indicators show in consumer confidence is coming back. Currency has appreciated so far this year. And also, if you can look at share price index, also very positive. So we see consumer sentiment and the demand is picking up. That's why we think recovery will commence for the second half and going forward.
This ought to be an opportunity to stabilise the situation in the longer term, to really de-risk the economy in the longer term at a fiscal level. What needs to be done?
That's also what is important, not only for the central bank. Minister of Finance, first important one to ensure fiscal path, fiscal trajectory moving towards generating a primary surplus of 2.3% on the long-term basis. And fiscal consolidation process must continue as announced in the IMF program. And the other important part is the structural reforms, institutional reforms, addressing corruption and vulnerabilities, protecting social safety net, all are important pillars. This is an opportunity to implement all these difficult reforms. They already implement some of the SOE, set-on price reforms, cost reflecting pricing formulas, privatization and improving the structure of the set-on prices, and also Central Bank Act. But most important is corruption and vulnerability. New anti-corruption law has been discussed at the Parliament. New Central Bank Act, institutional reforms, and also Fiscal Responsibility Act to ensure going forward there will be no fiscal slippages. Those has to be institutional reforms that just to ensure going forward we have a stable macroeconomic policy framework and we are moving in the right direction.
Now, meanwhile, former director of the central bank, Dr. Roshan Pereira, comments that there are issues in terms of sufficiency and fairness in the government's domestic debt restructuring plans. In our new segment, Debt Treatment, What's Next?, Dr. Roshan went on to say that domestic debt restructuring must be once and for all, and that if the country is to restructure its debt again in future, it would lead to higher costs and uncertainty.
So in discussing the debt restructuring process, I think the two things that I would want to highlight is whether, particularly in terms of the domestic debt restructuring, whether it was sufficient, and secondly, whether there was fairness across creditors. So when we talk about sufficiency, it's basically debt restructuring. Will it enable the country to meet the IMF debt sustainability target? Because what they have asked is that we have to bring down the debt to GDP ratio down to 95% by 2032, and secondly, to bring down the gross financing needs of the government, which is basically the amount that the government needs both to finance its deficit and its debt service payments from the current levels of about 35% down to under 13% on average over a period from 2027 to 2032. Now, whether this is going to be sufficient to achieve that is a question, because one of the premises is that the government's deficit will be in surplus from next year and then go on to a surplus of 2.3%. There is a risk in that because even currently the government has not been able to meet its revenue targets. Secondly, it's in terms of fairness. When you look at the negotiations that were conducted with the external creditors, it was conducted on basis of four principles. One is that it was a transparent process. That secondly, it was in good faith as a collaborative process. Third, that it was fair and comparable treatment across creditors. And fourthly, that there was consistency with the IMF debt service targets. Now, when you come to this thing of fairness, whether this was fair is a question, because the entire domestic restructuring has been borne by two. The central bank is bearing 1% of the reduction in the gross financing needs, and the 0.5% is basically from the provident funds. All the other creditors have not been included in this debt restructuring. But I think the main issue is really whether this is sufficient, because if we have to go for another debt restructuring, the costs are going to be high, the uncertainty is going to be high, and it's going to put the country again on another path of this whole uncertain trajectory. We must be very sure that this is once and for all debt restructuring, which will put our debt onto a sustainable path.
Now, capital markets expert Deshan Pushparaja says the government should not create space for the creation of monopolies while introducing state-owned enterprise reforms. Speaking to Indivari Amuwatta in our current affairs program at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24, he said that breaking the monopolies will have more competition in the market, which will benefit the consumer from competitive pricing. Meanwhile, financial markets expert Ravi Abesuriya said the government's aim to introduce holding company structure, which is prevalent in countries such as Singapore, is the way forward for Sri Lanka.
From your perspective, what does it mean when we talk about the equal treatment of EPF?
There is an option that has been given to provident fund holders to either accept the restructure or accept a higher tax. And if you look at the other counterparts who hold bonds, like the banks, their effective tax rate is already 50%. It wasn't equal to start with in terms of the way income from bonds was treated. And so when you look at it that way and look at what has been proposed, given the circumstances, it's never ideal for anyone to take any negative impact from restructure. But we have to face reality that Sri Lanka has gone through its current crisis. I am a EPF holder myself, so I'm not necessarily happy about the fact that this slight reduction in income had to happen. But I think it was the most pragmatic solution, and I think the way in which it has been proposed is reasonable.
Going forward, how important is it as a country, as an economy, to fulfill our commitments and ensure that we fulfill these requirements when we talk about a rating perspective for international markets?
We saw rating agencies very proactively downgrading us long before people in Sri Lanka realize we are heading for disaster, because they can foresee very clearly the way the economy is managed, that we are going to hit the wall. Hopefully, if we do the right restructuring, structural changes, we will see the rating upgrades happening. As we go along, first of all, we have to agree with the international creditors and start repaying our debt at some point in the future, maybe next year. As we start, we will have our rating upgrades happening. And that will be a very positive message for the international community to start looking at Sri Lanka. And also, we should see some economic growth happening. We have negative growth. So if we really do well, we could go towards 5%. That's exactly what we should be aiming at. Plus, we have to encourage a lot of companies to export. So these two things are very important to get the exports going. That's why trade agreements matter. And the country's economy starts growing. Everybody will benefit.
How is this taken among the private sector?
Well, private sector wants the governments to be out of business. Now, that process is ongoing. We are talking about establishing, similar to Singapore, Tamasak, holding company structure, so that all the, at least the 52 strategic government-owned undertakings will come into the holding company. The most important thing when it comes to SOE reforms is preventing political interference. Only management issues, unfortunately, that has created a bloated public sector, as well as there are public sector institutions that have been continuously making losses, as Sri Lankan Airlines, and now with IMF pressure, they're looking at selling Sri Lankan Airlines or some kind of a joint venture. Even if the SOE is making profits, still there is a lot of political interference. So that's why it makes a lot of sense to what has been already privatized, like SLT, to be completely privatized through the stock exchange, so that it is very transparent and well run with the proper governance principles, which is internationally recognized. Singapore, Malaysia, all have done through this holding company structure, which is the way to go.
In my view, SOE reform on its own is not sufficient. There are two other commitments that need to be made. Number one is, if we move a state-owned enterprise which is a monopoly today and give it to the private sector and keep it as a monopoly, that's not going to benefit anybody. We are creating the same problem again, except now someone in the private sector is making huge arbitrage profit. So one commitment when privatizing or bringing a better structure to SOEs, the other commitment that needs to be made is monopolies need to be broken. Only if monopolies are broken can everything become more efficient. And as for us as Sri Lankan consumers, Sri Lankan citizens, we can enjoy the best of everything if monopolies are broken. And the other is pricing reform. No point bringing in a lot of private sector investors into key areas and then telling them you can't sell something beyond a certain price. Then nobody will want to sell, because business is there to make profit. You have to allow market prices to prevail.
Meanwhile, Indian Foreign Secretary Vinay Mohan Kwatra is scheduled to visit Sri Lanka in the upcoming week. The Indian Foreign Secretary is expected to arrive early next week to work out arrangements pertaining to President Ranil Wickremesinghe's visit to New Delhi, which is scheduled for the 20th of July. Since he took office in 2022, President Ranil Wickremesinghe is visiting India for the first time later this month, during which he is expected to hold bilateral discussions with Indian Premier Narendra Modi. Minister of Fisheries Douglas Devananda, Minister of Power and Energy Kanchana Vijayasekara and Minister of Foreign Affairs Ali Sabri will accompany the President along with his Chief of Staff Sagala Ratnayaka. Chief of Presidential Staff Sagala Ratnayaka instructs health sector officials to thoroughly investigate the accuracy of media reports concerning the health sector crises. This was expressed by him during a meeting held with the health sector officials to discuss issues pertaining to drug and medical equipment shortages. Ratnayaka also emphasized that necessary measures should be promptly implemented to ensure the comfort and well-being of patients. A special meeting chaired by Senior Advisor to the President on National Security and Chief of Presidential Staff Sagala Ratnayaka was held at the Presidential Secretariat yesterday to solve the issues pertaining to drug and medical equipment shortages and to address concerns about the quality of medicines. During the meeting, which was attended by the Minister of Health Keheliya Ramukwalla, President Secretary Saman Ekanayaka and the Treasury and Health Secretaries, discussions were held on crucial matters pertaining to the health sector, emphasizing the need for urgent measures to address them. Senior Advisor to the President on National Security Sagala Ratnayaka instructed the officials to thoroughly investigate the accuracy of media reports concerning the health sector crises. In order to address the issues of delays in payment of funds to suppliers of the Ministry of Health, the Finance Ministry emphasized on steps taken to settle the outstanding payments following the instructions of President Ranil Wickremesinghe. In addition, decisions were taken pertaining to further deliberations with international organizations to minimize the challenges faced by the Ministry of Health. Sagala Ratnayaka also emphasized that necessary measures should be promptly implemented to ensure the comfort and well-being of patients. Now, the government of Netherlands will be returning some of the objects they wrongfully brought from Sri Lanka during the colonial period. According to the Dutch Secretary of State for Culture and Media, the transfer of ownership to Sri Lanka will take place later this year.
Issuing a statement, the government of Netherlands stated that they will be returning 478 objects of cultural significance to Indonesia and Sri Lanka which have been wrongfully brought to Netherlands during the colonial period, acquired under duress or by looting. The decision has been made following the consideration of requests made by the governments of Indonesia and Sri Lanka. As per the decision which was made by Dutch Secretary of State for Culture and Media Guneoslu, following the recommendations of the Advisory Committee on the Return of Cultural Objects from Colonial Context, the transfer of ownership to Sri Lanka will take place later this year. According to the Government of Netherlands, items that will be returned to Sri Lanka include Levique's cannon, ceremonial sword, Sinhalese knife and 2 guns. The Dutch government stated that the return process forms the basis for further cooperation between the two countries and the cultural institutions concerned, while adding that Sri Lanka and Netherlands will remain in dialogue in order to develop this cooperation further.
Now, while exporters worry over the government's decision to abolish the simplified value-added tax, the Finance Ministry assures that it will not be abolished without a proper refunding mechanism. More news after this short commercial break. Stay.
ගොඩමඩ පෙරලි කරන බලපුළුවන්කාරයා මහින්ද්‍රා යුවෝ ටීමෝ වෙතින්. වැඩම ගොඩයි ගොඩම තමයි. ස්වරාජ් ට්‍රැක්ටර් ටීමෝ වෙතින්. අපේ ගෙදරත් ආපිකෝ මෙට්‍රස් තමයි. මාදිලි රසකින් යුත් මෙට්ටලුවේ ප්‍රමුඛයා. ආපිකෝ මෙට්‍රස් සැපනින්දට සැප මෙට්ට.
Welcome back. Now in your business news, tax policy advisor to the Ministry of Finance, Tanuja Perera, assured that the simplified value-added tax will not be abolished from next year if there is no proper refunding mechanism. Speaking at a seminar held yesterday, Deputy Chairman of the Joint Apparel Association Forum of Sri Lanka, Felix Fernando, suggested that the government could seek assistance in formulating a mechanism to obtain refunds upon the abolishment of SVAT.
A seminar on the removal of the simplified value-added tax organised by the National Chamber of Exporters of Sri Lanka was held in Colombo yesterday.
What prompted the IMF officers to include this as a proposal?
Removal of SVAT. Currently it is at the drafting stage, and the reason for removing SVAT, there are a number of reasons. If we analyze the refund numbers and the SVAT numbers, we can see great disparity between the two. Currently we are in a situation where we need to have more revenue mobilized. We are far behind the targets set for the 2023 as well, and we have to look for much revenue avenues as well as where the leakages takes place. So we have to enhance the revenue by introducing new mechanisms as well as optimizing the existing system. The removal of SVAT is to address these both issues, because in one hand protect the exporters by having a refunding mechanism in place and protect the revenue by preventing the leakages. Currently tentatively it will be implemented from 24 January 1st, but I can assure one thing: if there is no proper refunding mechanism in place, we are not going to take out the SVAT. If we are taking out SVAT, definitely there will be a proper refunding mechanism.
Are you confident that the assurance given here will take, or do you fear that we are going to go back to the same old thing before the SVAT was introduced?
By doing something without thinking through the entire process of refunds, ensuring that the cash flow of the exporters are not pulled into a system which will cripple the exports, that's what we are fearful of, which will make the 90% of the exporters uncompetitive. And when you put additional issues and burdens like this, we are fearful. But as you have given the guarantee that it will not be implemented without a proper refund system, I think we don't need to worry.
Are you confident that the removal of SVAT and bringing back the old scheme will speed up the refunds?
We can't ensure that even abolishing SVAT, we are able to eliminate the corrupt systems unless otherwise everything becomes transparent. So as apparel exporters, we aren't happy they abolished the SVAT. So people need to understand these companies, the working capitals are thin, and at a time that the interest rates are also high, to borrowings are also not easy. But in case there is no other option, I hope as IMF, as Ms. Tanuja mentioned, that there should be a proper mechanism, and maybe I suggest maybe you can talk to, if I'm not mistaken, IMF has kept one of their officers at the permanently staying in the IRD now. and maybe even we can ask some help from IRD, not a financial aid, but also technical assistance in setting up a proper mechanism. I think in that way, probably we'll be able to proceed.
Most of us, we export. Our export markets are not doing well. All tea, apparel, all buyers are asking better prices, lower prices. We are trying to keep our costs lower to increase or compete in the international market. So those additional cost of electricity, the fuel and other expenses have gone up a lot. So this is why we are worried. We don't want, again, keep a lot of our money with the Inland Revenue Department for collection. So this is why the exporters are very worried. We are all talking about it, that we don't want this to happen, or maybe if it has to go on, that we have a system to collect this money back immediately.
Now, Sri Lanka records $2.822 billion as inward foreign remittances during the first 6 months of this year. This is a 75.7% increase compared to the corresponding period of 2022, which recorded a substantially lower value of $1.609 billion.
According to the Minister of Labour and Foreign Employment Manushana Nayakkara, Sri Lanka recorded $475.7 million as inward foreign remittances in June this year. This figure is a slight decline of 0.83% compared to the $479.7 million earned last month. That accounts for a tally of $2.822 billion as the cumulative figure for the first 6 months of the year 2023. This translates to an increase of 75.3% from the corresponding period of 2022, which recorded a substantially lower value of $1.609 billion. The central bank statistics note that Sri Lanka has earned $3.7 billion as inward foreign remittances in 2022.
And with that, we wrap up tonight's edition of AdaDerana First at 9. Stay in touch with us on www.adaderana.lk for the latest developments around the clock. Thank you. Have a great night.
For news and information you can trust 24 hours a day, visit AdaDerana.lk.